Hello and welcome to Top of the Class with Grand Canyon University's College of Education. I'm Emily Pottinger,
And I'm Dr. Meredith Critchfield.
your hosts. So all of us, speaking of hosting, all of us are hosting and running so many virtual meetings these days, especially as educators. So we thought we'd bring in an expert who has probably recorded her fair share and hosted her fair share of virtual meetings. And so we have an expert who can teach us all the tricks to make these meetings run as smoothly, if that's possible, as smoothly as possible, and make sure they're as informative and as engaging as possible. This is a short and sweet extra credit episode for all of you teachers, admin, faculty, staff, parents, anyone out there who's using virtual meetings to communicate information in these really unique times. So Meredith, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, and I don't think any of us really anticipated the number of virtual meetings we would be hosting and attending. If you could have asked me a year ago if I would be sitting in 5 Zoom meetings a day, I would have said, no way, not possible. But here we are sitting in all these Zoom and WebEx meetings and Google Meet meetings all the time. And so we're so excited to welcome our guest who can kind of walk us through the best practices for hosting these virtual meetings. So Tiffany Newell, our awesome guest here today, is part of the faculty training and development team here at Grand Canyon University, and she earned her master's in educational leadership and supervision from Arizona State University. Emily and I are also alums of ASU. And she spent over 12 years as a classroom teacher, an instructional coach, academic data and process improvement specialist. So she really knows her stuff. And she also hosts a lot of virtual meetings. And when she's not here at GCU doing amazing work, she is enjoying adventure time and having fun with her husband and her kids. So welcome, Tiffany. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yay. So Tiffany, we are going to dive right in with these extra credits. And we want to throw out just kind of a general question to you. We've been fortunate enough to be attendees in some of your very own virtual meetings, and they really seem to go pretty seamlessly. So we'd love to have you throw out some of your best practices and tips for the listeners out there.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you feel like they go seamlessly because, we always feel different on the other end. But I'm so happy to share. I think really we can focus on 3 topics when we're planning these kinds of things, and it's the before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting, right? And so, yeah, I think I just want to kind of go right into that. And my number one, my most important tip, the first one I want to talk about, is just becoming familiar with your virtual platform or app that you're using.
Sure.
So there's a bunch of them out there. There's Zoom, which I'm most familiar and partial to, obviously. But there's also Teams, GoToMeetings, WebEx, and I've been fortunate enough to have experience in all of those platforms. So I think the number one tip I have is it's just so important to understand the functions and the tools that are available in your particular platform that you're using.
Sure.
So just those functions, right, of how to set it up and be part of it. And I think that my second tip there would be to practice. So before you have your meeting, I have grabbed friends and colleagues, but I've even had my own kids and my husband log into a meeting just so I can understand how I can control that meeting. Muting people or letting them attend, what is that called?
Oh, like letting them enter the meeting.
The waiting room?
So accepting them.
Accepting them.
The waiting room.
And there's the waiting room in Zoom. But just knowing how it works from their end too, so that we can support those attendees or participants. So I'll have my husband log in from his phone because, sometimes our attendees are on the go and we want to be sure that we can see what it's like from their perspective and help them troubleshoot if needed.
Yeah, Tiffany, that resonates really well to me because, for those of us that are out there working with students, whether they're younger students or they're college students, we need to be able to troubleshoot and see what the students are seeing. So not just kind of adult to adult type meetings, but when we're talking about that meeting space with students, we need to be extra familiar with not only our side as the facilitator, but what the viewers are seeing. So that was a great tip.
Yeah, thanks. I think that is the most important too, just because we do want to troubleshoot, but we also want to see what it's like from their perspective. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that those are my first two is just get familiar with the platform and the functions and how to facilitate, and then practice it. Know what it looks like on both ends from both perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
So that really encourages a more comfortable facilitation process too, because it allows for you to be flexible but also responsive in the event that there are technical issues or things like that.
Sure,
So
sure.
yeah, so I think that really after that's done, still part of that before the meeting, um, become familiar with the tools and the different apps that allow for engagement during the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So most all platforms that I've had experience with all have some kind of a chat feature or a chat box. Some apps have different tools that are available. I know in Zoom we have polls and breakout rooms, but almost all of them have that chat feature.
Yeah.
And I think that we could really focus on that just for having a smooth meeting, but also an engaging kind of a meeting. We want our participants to get something out of the meeting or the class, right? If we're teaching
Yeah.
online. So I think that is another feature. And some strategies are simple, but the number one engagement strategy is to be explicit and demand engagement. So when we are being explicit by demanding our participants to engage by sharing in the chat box something or posting a question even on our slide and having them answer in the chat box, if we're not familiar or comfortable with some of the other tools, that chat box is pretty invaluable, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So those are some ways where we can just demand engagement from our participants.
Now, Tiffany, I
Um,
have a question for you that a lot of my teacher friends have been asking me. A lot of my student teachers are asking me, what do we do about this, the student or the attendee who blanks out their screen and just actively chooses not to be active? They kind of check out and they just allow themselves to be on, but not actually engaging. What do you do about those sort of stragglers, if you will, that are just not hopping in, even though you're demanding that engagement?
Mm-hmm.
I think that in that case, I defer back to my classroom days where I don't want to say I would call the student out, but I might say, "Oh, John, in about 3 minutes, I'm going to ask you a question," and just say their name because
Mm-hmm.
you want them to know and they want to know that you're paying attention to them too. And it doesn't matter how old somebody is, or what kind of meeting it is, they want to be recognized. And I think that you would only really have to do it once because maybe somebody thinks they can just sit in the meeting and kind of skate on by. And then if they're allowed to do that, they're going to do that every time.
Yeah.
So I think if we're very cognizant and purposeful in our meeting and paying attention to our attendees, that you know, do it right away. Hey, call on them and demand that engagement from the beginning, and they'll know what to expect next time.
Well, and
Absolutely.
I would say that strategy has worked very well in a few of the meetings that I've been in as a participant. And the meetings that you kind of have to be very present for, and that you need to be actively engaged. Like there are some very large meetings that maybe it's more informational, but it only has to happen one time to one person. for you to kind of, oh, okay, I need to be on my toes. I need to be actively engaged in listening, participatory. So not to make an example of any particular student or person, but I think that point hits home because you really only have to do it once or twice in general. And then most people would be like, oh, kind of like perk up a little bit and become more engaged.
Right. And there's
Yeah.
the opposite of that. Like we can positively reinforce those who are participating. Like, oh my gosh, that was a great question, Susan. Thank you so much. Or I really love that. And I hope all of you guys heard that great question. I'll repeat it so everyone can hear it and really think and reflect on that. So we can also kind of hone in on those individuals who are really contributing so that others sort of sit up, take notice and think, oh, maybe I should probably be doing that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could also share those expectations before your meeting. You know, when you send out the meeting invite, I want to remind everybody to have their cameras on during this time, and be sure you're familiar with the reactions. And I think that it's important that when somebody does share something, that everybody else does a little clap hands or thumbs up, you know, in agreement, and just kind of setting that tone of engagement, I think is great. And the chat box alone does allow for that. And so no matter what platform you're using, we can demand that engagement by using the chat box and just having our cameras on and being able to look and talk to each other, which also goes back to that whole be comfortable and prepared with how the meeting runs. I know, and again, I'm a little partial to Zoom because I use it more often, but I know how to see all of my students' faces on one screen, and yes, I do have another monitor, and I think most of us do. But I don't need to see my presentation if they're looking at it. So I can drag the screen over and look at their faces while I'm sharing my information. And there's just different ways that we can prepare to be comfortable during our presentation and still engage with our students at the same time.
So,
Yeah.
Tiffany, you mentioned like a lot of these apps have pretty similar features. They can offer, our attendees can offer reactions, they can engage in a poll, they can engage in the chat box. So do you feel like the chat box is sort of like that number one must use engagement tool, and then the others are sort of like extra icing? Or would you say there's another one that you find to be even more helpful?
I would say the chat box is the number one, just because in the chat box you can also paste links. So if I wanted my students to participate on like a Padlet board, I can paste the link in there, or a poll everywhere. I could have them to go to poll everywhere, and I could pull the screen up. If I'm not yet comfortable with the poll functionality in the Zoom, that chat box is awesome. I know in Zoom it also allows for file attachments. So if I want to share a handout with my students, I can just upload it right there in the chat box and they can all access it. So for me, the chat box is just where you can demand that engagement and you can be explicit. Hey, everybody share this answer, and you can share it to me privately, so I don't want everybody reading each other's answers, you know, but they can still share it in that chat box, and no matter what platform you're in, they all have a chat box. And then I think, so yes, that would be the number one, because there are so many options, it can be overwhelming. And so then try another one next time, and maybe another, and find what you like to use, but give yourself some grace and don't have so many expectations. Like, don't demand so many expectations of yourself, right? Because you can engage with your students or your attendees, whoever your audience is, in the chat and just by looking at each other. So I think that kind of sums it up for like the before the meeting. It's just really important to be prepared.
Yeah.
And with that, you need to consider the purpose, right? So you're being prepared, consider your lesson plan or your meeting plan. Have an agenda. What do you want your participants to know and be able to do or understand at the end of your meeting? And how are you going to facilitate that learning? And I think that is the two big questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're planning. So I know how to do the meeting. I know how to run this platform I'm using. What is the purpose of my meeting, right? And so now I know these little engagement things. How do I want my participants to engage? So that's kind of where that comes in that before. And then I
Awesome.
think for during the meeting, like when it starts, my number one tip is don't share anything except for your cameras, and give a couple of minutes to greet your participants or your guests. Have some dialogue that is, unrelated to the topic of the meeting. So a lot of times we talk about the weather if we're from different places, but you could also say like what's a vacation you're looking forward to, or just kind of have those conversations. Ask your participants to share it in the chat, read some of them, or just have that open meeting where you're all kind of talking to each other and you can all see each other. Building that trust and that relationship before you get into the meeting will just kind of set everybody's nerves down.
I really like that. I think, we talk a lot about the physical classroom environment, and when we're talking about, and even the online classroom environment, but when we're talking about these virtual meetings, that's another environment. So I think setting the tone and having something a little more lighthearted, Meredith and I were just talking about, lightheartedness yesterday. I think that's important, especially right now when there's a lot of heavy stuff, a lot of stress is going on.
Absolutely. It is important. It's a critical component because your participants will see you as a person, and they will feel like you see them as a person even though we're far away. And it just creates a more comfortable environment overall.
Sure.
Yeah. I think that during the meeting, my next tip, I know I've said to be explicit or demanding of engagement, but I think that it's important to use transitional phrases. So along with being prepared, be explicit and say, we're gonna get started now. Like, or okay, we're gonna go ahead and turn it over to somebody else, or whatever it is. Be very explicit and use those transitional phrases. It's important to communicate the purpose of the meeting, even though they're attending the meeting and they know why. But state it, communicate that. What is the purpose of this meeting? And then again, transition into today we will talk about this, or today we're going to look at this. But right there, while you're going over, maybe you have an agenda, which is nice to have an agenda to share. First, we're going to do this in a second. But during that time, ask your participants, please share in the chat what you already know about this topic or something you're wondering. And let them start thinking about that, because that gets them in the mindset of, okay, there is a purpose to this meeting, which will kind of allow for more engagement for those stragglers that we were talking about before, right? You set the tone and say, share in the chat now, right away. They're like, oh, I already got to do this,
Sure. Absolutely.
So I think it's just important to have those transitional phrases. And then, all right, we're gonna look at, or first we're gonna talk about this, and then have some kind of a deliverable or assessment prepared. What is going to tell you that your participants comprehended what you wanted them to comprehend, or they took away from the meeting what the purpose of the meeting was? So it could be another question in the chat, right? It could be an outside tool. Maybe it's a poll. You know how to do the polls. Maybe it's they're gonna share out loud and talk during the meeting. Whatever it is, just having something prepared to assess that learning, and just being prepared. Having your kind of write it out, almost like a lesson plan. I have my agenda, and then this is what we're going to talk about, and this is when I'm going to ask them to participate. So that's my my tips for during the meeting, is just be intentional, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would also, I've been thinking about the chat box, and I think one of the things that I've learned, it depends on the meeting, it depends on what you're doing. But if you have a rather large meeting or event that you're holding virtually, because that chat box can be so valuable, having kind of a designee to help with the chat box can be super beneficial. That's just something that I've recently learned. And I know, Tiffany, you and I have kind of helped each other out in that area over over the course of some of our virtual meetings. But even if it's a student, if they're a responsible student at the right age, range, having them be in charge of letting you know if there's questions that come up, or even letting the class or the participants in the meeting know, I'm going to do a little presenting, we're going to do a little activity, and then I'll check the chat box, so that they know if they're asking questions and they're not being answered right away, the reason why. So I think, love the chat box and figuring out kind of how to best use it in different situations during the meeting.
Absolutely. No, that is a great point. And I am usually a chat person, especially when we do some of our faculty advisory board workshops. I man the chat forum, and the chat can get really, really crazy. I mean, if there's a lot of participants, as you
Yeah.
said, and I've shared this with instructors that have asked me this question, like, I can't be reading the chat box and presenting. And I said, no, and nobody wants to stare at you while you're reading something, So I said that was a great example. You can
Yeah.
have a designated person, or you can have designated times where you are going to check the chat box and just share some
Yeah.
things out loud with your class to keep it going. But I think this works with kids too. There can be like a student of the day, and you can train them and talk about the chat box and allow them to be part of that learning environment, because it
Yeah.
is different.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the chat box can get crazy. I would say for bigger groups, try to find a poll feature, even if it's an outside link like Poll Everywhere, where everybody can chime in, and then you can see the percentage and get reports later. The
Mm-hmm.
poll feature is really simple in Zoom. In fact, you can set it up before, and it'll tell you how many participants have. It'll say 12 out of 14, or it'll tell you who's participated
Yeah.
or how many.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is a really great point, and I think it allows for ownership too
Yeah.
in the classroom. Like if everybody kind of gets to take a turn, I'm the chat box reader today. It it,
Absolutely.
it doesn't matter how old students are at that point, or participants, but if it's a meeting, it's always good to have a buddy, always good to have like a chat person.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that after the meeting, it's important to review that feedback in the chat box. Kind of review your chat box, see the feelings of the participants and the answers, and if they were getting it, just for your own personal reflection. And did they meet those objectives or comprehend the purpose of the meeting? And then
Mm-hmm.
think about what you might change next time. If it is your first time, your chat box is out of control, how do you address that? So
Yeah.
it's important to always practice reflective
Practice.
Yes.
Practice reflective practice. I think that's a common thread that Meredith and I have talked about on many of our episodes. As teachers, we have to reflect on our own practice, and meetings are part of it. We know at the end of the day, we're going to be holding meetings with parents, meeting with administration, meetings with fellow teachers. So I think it's just as important, the tips that you've shared, it's just as important to consider the planning, the during, the after, as it is with our lessons, because like you
Yes.
said, we want that engagement and we want them to be purposeful. And nothing worse, teachers can all come together and agree that we heavily dislike the meeting that doesn't seem to have a purpose.
Right. Right. Or something even to look at. I mean,
Yeah.
if somebody's just talking at us, right?
Yeah.
So it's important to have those little things. Absolutely. I like to say be hip,
Be hip.
be happy, be intentional, be prepared because nobody wants to listen to an Eeyore either, right?
Oh my gosh, that's a great acronym.
So
That
be
is good.
happy, be intentional, and be prepared.
I
So
like it. I like it.
That's good. One of my pet peeves from virtual meetings is when someone says they'll do something after the meeting and they don't follow through. So for me, that's like one of my things that I think about after a meeting. Oh, I'm going to send you guys these links. I'm going to send you the recording. I'm going to follow up with a question about so-and-so. I'm going to ask our instructional coach this. I'm going to talk to the principal, but then they don't do it and they don't follow through. And that is like one of those things where I'm like, I've seen it happen so many times that I've learned, oh wait, no, hold on. I got to close this loop so that everybody's getting what they need. And there's like a full purpose to this meeting.
that is an excellent point for the after the meeting. Are there any things to follow up with? Did you make any promises that you are going to send or share documents? Absolutely. That is a really good point.
Especially in meetings, I feel like, when we're working with colleagues, the action items or the takeaways, if you have a note taker or just somebody to say, hey, after the meeting, don't forget, so-and-so has to do this, so-and-so has to do this.
Right. There has to be some kind of a follow-up. And I think that for meetings, especially virtual meetings, that's where our agenda becomes so critical and important, but also sharing an agenda with everybody and then sending out those meeting minutes after the meeting with those items on there as action items. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes that's forgotten. So.
Absolutely. So you gave us that awesome hip tip, be hip. But is there any other big idea, big takeaway that you want to leave us with?
I think that be hip kind of covers it.
It's a good
But
one.
really be prepared and be intentional. Know what you want your meeting, what the purpose of your meeting is and what you want your participants to get out of it. And how are you going to know? How do you know they got out of it what you wanted them to?
So we can mock up little meeting objectives for ourselves, just like we did for our lesson plans.
Absolutely. Be prepared. That's the number one.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, that is all for today in our extra credit. Thank you so much, Tiffany. We had a blast chatting with you and learned a ton. And we also want to thank Grand Canyon University's Worship Arts Studio in the development of Top of the Class.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. I will work on being hip for sure. And yeah, thank you to the Worship Arts Studio. Y'all make us sound like pros. And for everyone listening, we really hope that you will rate and subscribe the podcast, especially if you are in iTunes. It definitely helps us become more visible to other teachers out there, and that's really important to us. So if you have any requests for podcast topics, we are all ears. If you want to chat about the amazing tips Tiffany shared today, we are also all ears. So tweet us at GCU_TOTC. This has been Top of the Class with Emily and Meredith. And until next time, go Lopes!